passage is broken down, then we'll pick up with the other sins that we did not get to in our list. So the first phrase was being filled with all unrighteousness. The idea is that heart and their passion is full of things that are contrary to God's will. Knowing the judgment of God. In other words, their conscience understands what God's just demands call for, but they don't do it. That which is committed, they commit things that are worthy of death. We know that the wages but have pleasure in them that do them. Another one, know is wrong. They should actually celebrate and see as an honor. Okay, the second thing we're going to look at here is the way that he breaks down this sin list. The first thing we saw is that there were 4 forms of sin that will ultimately, we're talking about fornication's a general person's heart is full of evil purposes. About when they get up, it's what people think about when they're going to bed. Their mind is full of evil purposes continually. Covetousness, a person who is greedy and discontented. Maliciousness, a person who is bitter and desires to harm others. So those can get to backbiters. Let's talk about backbiters. A list of sins. Do we have a tendency to kind of categorize these? Do you know what I mean? To kind of really focus on dealing with them? Do we have a series preached in our church? I think it would be 2008. And Jerry Bridges was not suggesting that these sins are okay. It's like we've categorized them as, well, it's probably not the best, but it's okay. Well, we do that. That's basically what he's drawing us to see, is that we have a tendency to kind of categorize things. Now, there is a side to this where one of the reasons we do that is because we recognize that certain sinful, they seem to be more glaring and obvious than others, but God doesn't really make that distinction. In this passage, we're going to see the sins that we might call respectable in the eyes of people and the sins that we would see as shameful in the eyes of people. So the first one, backbiters. What do you think that word means? Disagreeable to authority. Okay, that definitely can be an area that we see this play out. Yeah. Any other ideas? A backbiter. Yeah. So we no doubt about it. Is it easier to talk to someone face? There's a reason that social media can be you almost feel like a place where we see rather than speaking face to face, goes behind the back and talks to the person. I think we could even say use that word. They are not bold in their opinion. They are going to go around the system. But they can be just as dangerous. In fact, I would say even more dangerous than someone who is going to look you in the eye and tell you exactly what they think, even if it's a really nasty thing that they think about you. Drawing them into this situation. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Definition of sorts that I'll give. It's someone who has an openly aggressive slander. So they are going to, slander is you're going to go to people and you're going to try to undermine somebody, okay? What you're saying may be true. It may be partially true. It might be entirely not to destroy this person. And that's the idea of a backbiter. Basically, what it comes down to is they're not afraid of God who sees everything. The second one we'll talk about is haters of God. I guess this would be a real easy one to define. So anybody want to step out on a limb and explain what that means? Haters of God. There you go. So the idea is that there's this arrogance. We often don't think about, we think about people disobeying God, but we sometimes have a hard time thinking of someone disobeying God because they nature towards God's ways. And so, now this one might be a little bit tougher for you to. Not really a word we use very often. That's definitely, it's okay. Despiteful. Does anyone? Yeah. Okay. So you could say like excessive self-confidence, excessive pride. So this word despiteful kind of falls into that category. So you have a person who is full of pride, and therefore you have anger that's sort of like reactionary, right? So someone just kind of reacts in a moment, they say something explosive, they do something explosive, and then a day or two later they're like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that, I'm sorry. Maybe they acknowledge it, maybe they don't. But that's kind of like an explosion. They explode in a moment, and it's not so much that their bitterness means that they feel justified to do what they're doing, but they kind of feel bad that it looks so bad on them because of the way that they responded. Guilty about what's been seen. They some on the line of what you're saying there. Okay? Can you think of any biblical examples of a person who was like this? Who responded in this kind of a way? So Saul, the later he got in his life, the more he became that way. Yeah, definitely. Think about Herod when he was, okay? Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, absolutely. When he throws the people into the lion's den. Yeah, absolutely. I think Nebuchadnezzar would fall into this category. Yeah. And you don't do this. Only God could deal with that man like that. Okay, number 4. Proud. I guess we don't really have to have a hard time dealing with that one, but the idea is kinds of sinful behavior. Boaster. Talk about it, but I want you to give me some biblical examples that you could think of people who fell into this category of a boaster. So how would you define boasters? It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point because getting ready to go to the mission field, there was a missionary who gave me this book called Ugly Americans. Okay, I don't know if any of you ever read this book, and he wasn't trying. Whenever you are living overseas, a lot of the people who travel, who are Americans, they're very loud. They're very entitled when they go into a restaurant or something like that. That is going to be part of the cultural challenge you're going to deal with. That you're not the first American maybe somebody in your city has dealt with. And the first American that they dealt with was a guy on a business, very, very arrogant, involved in terrible things. A person who spends their time puffing themselves over Babylon, and he says, is this not the... Well, true story, now you're going to learn what you really are. And you're going to be humbled. So I think of Nebuchadnezzar in that moment. I do think about the story that Jesus tells of the man who looked at and he said, look at all the abundance that I have. I'm going to build bigger barns. I'm going to fill them up and I'm going to just eat, drink, and be amazed. But God said, how about day? And that's not just proud, but it's a person who, the idea, boasters. Okay, number 6, inventors of evil things. Inventors of evil things. What does this mean? The Assyrians. Things that God gave us is this incredible mind that can think about how to do things faster, do things better. When we talk about a tool, what is a tool? It's something that makes something that is not accessible. It makes something that you can do, makes it a little bit easier so you can do more. You can do it more efficiently. So we tend to think of technology in the realm of trying to make life easier, do things better. We think of it being a very positive thing, and many times it is a very positive because of the technology itself, but because of the way that we use the technology. So when you talk about someone who is an inventor of evil things, it's a person who, in other words, they're inventing technology not for the good of more easily and more quickly. Okay? Could we use the example of Adolf Hitler and the Jews during the Holocaust? That's exactly what Adolf Hitler was doing. Use his manpower to eliminate. This is something that can happen on a personal level, on a national level. It can happen on a lot of different levels. And when we talk about the flood, it tells us that mankind plotting and scheming and planning how they could do things that were evil. So it's very, very important for us to think about that. In other words, you're taking the good gifts of God, your strength, your instruction. Yes? Yes, that is true. Or preoccupied with your work, the more time is not being spent on those prophets. When God talks about Sodom, which was what we tend to think about when we think of Sodom, and because of their prosperity and because of their time, that's ultimately what they did. And so the question is, are we not also people that can end up in place? I don't mean to that extent, but we are human. We could end up in very dark places if we use our time very foolishly and very destructively. Yes. Okay. Number 7. This must be the number of perfection right here today. Disobedient to parents. Let's talk about this one for a moment. Disobedient to parents. Question. Does he put an age limit on this? Does he put an age limit on this? When I asked that question, you kind of went to the, like, is there a cap on how old I can be? and my mind was kind of going towards is that this concept of parental authority is something that God created for our good. And when he's talking about disobedient to parents, I think he's thinking primarily until they're no longer under the jurisdiction of mom, dad, parents. So he's not talking about dishonor here, though dishonor is part of this, obviously, but he's focusing on disobedience. I think it's very interesting because in this list, we have a sin that is going to be most likely connected to people who are very young. People who are 5, 6, 8, their behavior, it's cute, it's funny. Well, it's not very nice, but it's a good thing that they're only this tall right now instead of this tall, and they only weigh 35 pounds. They don't. Deviant and very, very destructive society where there's no restraint. There's no one that is teaching them what is right. There's no one that's giving them the gospel. There's no one that's restraining their actions, saying, you will. Of a society, you know where it's starting? In the home. Society today, we could talk about school systems, we can talk about media, we could talk about technology, but what we really need to talk about is our families. Because our families is where the problem is beginning. And so technology is a tool that can be used for good. Technology is a false idea, and if mom and dad are engaged in conversation with their kids and they're shaping their kids and they're pointing them in the right direction, their children will be able to navigate through some of those things because they have that parental oversight and they have that relationship with mom and dad where they actually are listening to what they're saying. And when they're getting out of line, the list of what we tend to think of as the sins of adults also indicate, in my mind, that can children be debaters? Yes. Can children be slanderers, whisperers, backbiters? Of course they can. Can children hate God? Absolutely they can. I remember when I was coaching wrestling, I was dealing with some young men. These are like 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. And I'm telling you, these young men, scary, but it can happen. Proud boasters, absolutely. These things are all bound up in the hearts of children as well. So these are not just, when you turn 18, magically, now I'm accountable and now I have these issues that I struggle with. If your kid is 8 years old or 10 years old or 12 years old, they still need to be dealt with in these areas. And when we talk about raising our kids, sanctification, praying for their salvation, and then working with them as new creatures in Christ is hugely, hugely important. Okay, number 8, without understanding. By the way, let me make this comment too. When we read in the Old Testament about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the most telling moments in that passage is when the angels come to the house, and it says that the men of the city, the young and the old, were beating on that door to basically sexually assault the men that were in that house. The young and the old. So these would have been kids, young adolescents, people in that category. So that's important for us to consider. All right, without understanding. Number 8, without understanding. How would you communicate this one without understanding? Undiscerning. Okay, good word. Ignorant. Yes, another good word. Yes. Yes. Question. Should I even go here? Rob, are you going to answer that question? No, he's not going to. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, at the root of a lot is that people do not understand human nature. They don't understand that there is real evil in the world, and real evil has to really be restrained and confronted. They don't understand that you actually do need government to protect the innocent. Okay? There's not an appeal to a higher justice system than ourselves. This is where a lot of this stuff goes. And so if somebody has a biblical worldview, the way that they view people is different than those who have a completely secular worldview. If someone has a biblical worldview, what they believe to be morally right and morally wrong, what they believe to be constructive, or this concept of without understanding, as we depart from a knowledge of God and a recognition that we're answerable to someone that's higher than ourselves, who has the right to tell us this is right, this is wrong, well, guess what the end result of that is? It's going to be an unwillingness to see what should be obvious. It's an unwillingness to means well, common sense in a place where it's not good sense is common sense that's not good sense. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, go ahead. Oh man, Scott. Our greatest enemy is in our own heart. It really is. It really is. So, what's in our heart is what keeps us out of the kingdom. What's in our heart is why we abuse and are unjust. So that is, and what's in our heart is why we don't respond properly to the things that we deal with in life, and why our perspective isn't right. So that's where our greatest enemy ultimately lies. So, without understanding, people do not have sense that they should have in areas. All right, the next one, covenant breakers. Wow, that's a good one right there. So what is a covenant and what is a covenant breaker? Can you think of any examples of covenants that we might be inclined toward? Or yes, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. So a covenant is an agreement between parties, and we tend to think of it in a legal sense, covenantal agreements. But really, this concept of a covenant is you are entering into an agreement with somebody else, and then you decide, you know what, I'm just, not going to follow through with what I said I'd do. The idea is that people break their word and they cannot be trusted. What is it that causes a person to fulfill their commitment even when it's tough? Are they fulfilling their commitment because it's to their benefit? It's integrity. But what is ultimately guiding that? Their duty to who? To God, absolutely, yes. So when we talk about someone who's a covenant keeper, we say, the reason I'm going to follow through with my word here is not only or the most convenient. I'm following through because that doesn't have duty that's God-centered. Every commitment is ultimately breakable because it's all about what works for me. It's all about what's convenient for me, what's easiest for me. Do you see how ultimately our bond of our word is connected to our view of God and our relationship to God? So, very, very important. I think of the psalm where it talks about the person who swears to his own hurt, but the idea is they make a commitment. They know that And then once things unravel and they become difficult, they say, you know what? I broke it, I got to buy it. You know what I mean? It's like you're taking your kids to the store and you can do it two ways. Something breaks and you go, oh, just sweep that under there and not worry about it. Or go, all right, son, we're going to have to go and we're going to have to buy this. And something like that. You're teaching this issue that, you break it, you buy it. You commit to this, you should follow through with this. And ultimately, when a group of people gets to the place where their word can't be trusted, then everybody has to make defensive measures on every single level, and you can't live life the way that God intended it. So it's a very serious problem when it happens on a large scale. It's a very, very serious thing. Any comments there? Yeah, go ahead, Doug. Not rabbit trail too much, but so I would encourage you when you read the Old Testament to carefully read the language when there is a covenant being established. What you're going to see in those situations is that two people would make an agreement and there would be witnesses. And you know who one of the witnesses would always be? It would be God. And it's very interesting in the language they would say, if I break my word, then let God do such and such to me. Now, what's very interesting is that in a pagan culture, which obviously the Jews were God's people, the pagans, they all worshiped their own gods, they entered into covenantal agreements as well. And when they entered into covenant agreements, they also invoked a deity. Or then let this God do this. The greatest example of this is we see the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai with God, and what does he do? He says, I set before you life and death and blessings and cursing, so choose life. If you follow these laws, then I'm going to bless you and I'm going to allow you to prosper. And if you disregard my laws, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to judge you. And so when you have a society that doesn't believe in God, well, then who's going to hold you accountable? You don't have someone to appeal to. Departure from God is going to ultimately lead to people saying, I don't have anything to worry about. There is no God to call me to account here. Go ahead.
We have to recognize, too, that there are institutions that take us away from this idea of covenants. For instance, I think a lot of times insurance. People will say, well, I hit this other car and I have insurance, so let the insurance take care of it. I have no responsibility. And if certain things like insurance, we don't take
Responsibility is buying the insurance. So if you're not buying the insurance, that's your way of saying, well, I'm not going to take responsibility. If I'm buying the insurance, then I'm choosing to take risk on the fact. But yeah, I mean, it is true that something like insurance takes away a little bit of that sense. And in a society that didn't have that kind of a setup, then, but yeah, kind of interesting. But what is he talking about here? Without natural affection. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so the statement without natural affection is broad. That would be a category. But word. Excellent word. They should have affection towards their children. They don't. They should have affection toward a person who is in a tough place. Okay? It's like the Good Samaritan. So the Good Samaritan, you have this person that's been beat up and bloodied, and they're laying on the side of the road, and for all practical purposes, they're dying. And then, the Levite, he walked. That is without natural affection. That really is. In the story, the Samaritan was the one who looked at this person, and they were compassionate towards that person. They said, this guy needs help. I'm going to help him. So when we talk about without natural affection, there are lots and lots of different areas that this statement can go into. But the idea is that a person is calloused. Their heart is unaffected by situations that even a non-Christian, someone who they have no allegiance to God, even they recognize this person needs help. Move us. But when a person's heart becomes twisted in grace area, in the common conscience, in fact, I was commenting with a friend of these children were murdered by their mother. The affection that should be between them. Okay, 11 and 12, the last two. Implacable. Anyone want to comment on that one? Implacable. That's a word we all use every day, isn't it? Not be reasoned with because they have become, there's a difference between two people. Like, if you want to resolve the issue, then you have to listen to the other side. You have to kind of put yourself in their shoes, and you have to think through, okay, what part have I played to contribute to this problem? And on the other side, they're doing the same thing. They're thinking, well, we agree on the fact that our relationship is important. We do agree on the fact that we can take responsibility for our side. And we agree on the fact that grace can make the bridge where maybe we disagree. That makes sense. We go, maybe I don't do this well, but I know I'm supposed to do it. Well, someone who's implacable says, you know what? I don't need to hear your side of the story. I'm full. And this attitude of my way or the highway, and don't tell me anything about what I've done to you, that is what he means. Someone who is very, very, that helps us not to become what this is describing, implacable. Love, gentleness, meekness, patience. These are the kinds of words that keep someone from getting to this place where they become personal side, though. I don't know that Moses and Pharaoh to be, well, with him probably one of his wives. You know, or you wouldn't have wanted to be a servant working in his household, or, you know, somebody who was under his jurisdiction. Nabal is the one that came to mind. Yes. Yes. That is, in my mind, probably one of the best bad examples in the scriptures of a person who was really calloused. And Nabal's name mean never wrong. He was always right. He gave, you know, there was no grace, there was no mercy. It was all merciful. And I think that we know what that word means. It means they don't have compassion. And one of the things that characterizes godly people is compassion. So when we hear of a situation move our hearts, it does move our hearts. We are, and sometimes harsh, difficult action. Like maybe you have to discipline your children because of something that they did, but you're not doing it in anger. You're not doing it in hatred. You're not doing it because you've been offended and you're getting even with them. You be that balance there, unmerciful. So let's that we have. So what are some heard here? What are some applications you want to put out there? Yes. So there you get the works of the flesh, the fruit of the Spirit. You can see this correlation in opposite direction. Yeah, you're going to see that. Yes. Okay. So, I'll throw the first one out here. We need to address sin at the source. So when we find these sinful behaviors in our lives, number one, we have to admit it. That's huge. Yes. Okay. But then I have to go from admitting it to taking the decisive action to go deep down to the source of it. And I've got to address it at the source. Big time problem. It's a very destructive problem. It's a serious issue. If I only deal with it here, but I don't change what's down here, guess what happens? This becomes this over here. And then eventually I go, oh, I got to deal with this one too. And okay, these two, it seems like I'm kind of managing them, but I still haven't dealt with what's here. Then it's going to die at the fruit level. Very, very important. So I have to take decisive action to go down and to deal with what is there. And what is the source according to these verses? It's our view of who? It's our view of God. Do I love the Lord? Do I reverence him? Is he really my delight? Am I grateful to him? You know, a lot of the sins that we're talking about, they really find their root in ingratitude. And ingratitude is one of the things that we have absolutely no problems justifying many times. Because ingratitude is focusing on justice. I deserve this. God, then who am I ultimately upset with? Him. Not the people that are involved in the situation that gave me this. I'm ultimately upset with him because he allowed them to do that. He didn't stop them. He didn't deal with them as quickly or as forcefully as I think that he should. So ingratitude is at the source. We need to guard against the temptation to appease our conscience in areas where we are in sin while focusing on the sins of others. This is a big time problem. It is easy for us to, and I'll say this, especially men, who I'm sure some of our ladies know how your husbands can be, where there's a job at hand and he can focus on that job and it's like nothing else in the world because it's completely focused on this thing right in front of us. What you're doing is important and needs to be done. This is going on over here and we're ignoring it the entire time. And when somebody's trying to draw our attention to this over here, we can even be going, hey, what are you talking about? Look at how I'm dealing with this issue over here. And they're like, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this over here. Okay? We've got to make sure that we're not doing this, where we kind of compartmentalize. Third, we should say something about this tonight in our Galatians, when we have a fleshly matter, to take fleshly means to deal with that issue rather than spirit-filled means to deal with that issue. And so we need to take God's prescribed means, which deal with mortification, putting the lust to death, replacing it with godly virtue, and then growing created that are powerless to actually change us in these areas. The last thing I'm going to mention is that the only answer to the world's problems is ultimately found in the gospel, because he wants to preach the gospel to the people at Rome also. And why does he want to preach the gospel to the people at Rome also? So that they'll be unified and live in the light of the gospel, and they'll send him to an area that has no gospel witness. So Paul knows this is how people are, and Paul also knows that the gospel wickedness in prison to their own lustful passions and liberates them to walk new creatures in Christ, godly affections, walking in a way that pleases and honors the Lord. So that's really the heart and the sense of the passage in front of us. Any questions or comments before we close in prayer? That was our hamartiology study. So we talked about lots of sins today. Thank you so much for the scripture we looked at. I pray that you would convict us where we need to be convicted, encourage and strengthen us where we need to be encouraged and strengthened. Father, help us to be willing to do the work that you call us to do in sanctification, putting to death the works of the flesh and walking by the power of the Spirit. We ask that you'll bless during our Sunday morning service. I pray that the preaching, we would think about these wonderful truths that we'll express. Those who will be visiting with us this morning, that we would be very warm and welcoming to them, and that they would recognize that there is a spirit of love and Christ-likeness in this place. And I pray that they will do these things in Christ's name. Amen.